A school with 847 empty desks, a supermarket with 12,000 intact products on the shelves, a hospital with 340 prepared beds. Everything works. Everything is clean. No one can enter. Radiation doesn't forgive. And these places are no longer for the living. Chapter 1. The counter that never stops. Click, click, click. That dry metallic sound that never stops. It's the Geiger counter. And in these abandoned towns, that small device goes crazy. Literally. Look, when you're at home under normal conditions, a Geiger counter marks between 0.05 and 0.1 microsieverts per hour. Basically, silence. Maybe a click every few seconds. It's the natural background radiation that has always existed. Cosmic rays, the earth, construction materials. Nothing to worry about. But in these towns, I'm going to tell you about the countermarks numbers that shouldn't be possible. 50 microsieverts per hour, 100, sometimes 200. That means 500 times more radiation than your body can safely tolerate. And the sound becomes a machine gun. Each click is a radioactive particle passing through the detector. And when there are so many that the device can't keep up with them, then you know you're in serious trouble. Because those same particles that make the counter sound are passing through your body, breaking your DNA, destroying your cells, without you feeling it, without you seeing it. The thing is that your body has no way to detect radiation. You don't have receptors for that. It's like being attacked by an invisible enemy that you can't smell, can't touch, can't see. You can only hear it through that machine. Click, 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 the soundtrack of death. And what's most disturbing is that these counters keep working decades later, in towns where no one is left alive to hear them. They keep marking, keep making noise, like electronic sentinels guarding a cemetery that spans entire kilometers. There was a town. Well, it still exists, but it's no longer for humans. The authorities calculated that an unprotected person could be there for exactly 23 seconds before receiving a lethal dose of radiation. 23 seconds. Less time than it takes you to read this paragraph. The place had 2,300 inhabitants, entire families, children who went to school, merchants, grandmothers who knitted on their porches. Normal life, until one day everything changed. And when I say everything, I mean everything. In 6 hours, the town was empty, completely empty. The authorities arrived with their special suits, their crazed Geiger counters, and started taking people out, house by house. There was no time to pack. There was no time to say goodbye. There was no time for anything, just leave. Now, right now. And here comes what really gives you goosebumps. The town remains exactly the same. The houses are intact. The gardens grew wild. But the structures are still there. The cars in the streets, the toys in the yards, the curtains in the windows. It's as if people had disappeared by magic, but their lives were frozen in time. But no one can enter to see it up close, because those 23 seconds are still the limit. Decades later, the radiation is still as lethal as the first day. More lethal than standing next to a functioning nuclear reactor. More lethal than many war zones. Only here there are no explosions, there's no noise, just silence. And that damn counter that won't stop clicking. The drones they've sent to film the town sometimes break down from radiation. Electronic devices that work perfectly anywhere in the world, but in this place become junk in a matter of minutes. Because radiation doesn't just kill living tissue, it also fries circuits, damages chips, destroys everything it touches. So we know the place is lethal. But here comes something no one tells you. The things people left behind also became radioactive. And I'm not talking about metaphors or drama. I'm talking about pure, hard physics. A teddy bear abandoned in a room can emit 15 times more radiation than is safe for a human. Family photographs that remained on tables have cesium-137 levels that can be detected with instruments from 2 meters away. The clothes that remained hanging in closets could kill you if you wore them for 3 straight days. How is this possible? Simple. Radioactive contamination isn't like an oil stain you can clean up. They're microscopic particles that stick to everything. They get into clothing fibers, are absorbed into furniture wood, embed themselves in metal, in plastic, in everything. And here's what's really terrifying. These particles don't go away. Cesium-137 has a half-life of 30 years. That means every 30 years, half the radiation disappears, but only half. After 30 years, an object that emitted 15 times normal radiation now emits 7.5 times. After 60 years, 3.75 times. You have to wait about 300 years for something to return to almost normal levels. There are specialized teams that have entered with full protection suits to document the state of houses. And they've found things that break your heart. Family photo albums that literally glow under radiation detectors. Children's toys that can never again be touched by human hands. Love letters stored in drawers that became poison for anyone who reads them. It's as if radiation had turned these families' most precious memories into lethal weapons. Everything that once had sentimental value now is a mortal threat. The last physical connections to the lives that were lived there became untouchable forever. But if you think the worst are the contaminated objects, wait until I tell you about the air. Because in these abandoned towns, even breathing becomes a suicidal act. Radiation doesn't just contaminate surfaces, it also floats. Microscopic particles of plutonium-239, cesium-137, strontium-90, suspended in the air like an invisible and deadly dust. When you breathe in one of these places, you're not just inhaling oxygen, you're inhaling death. Scientists calculate that breathing the air in these zones is equivalent to getting 500 X-rays per minute. 500. In 1 minute. Your body receives more radiation in 60 seconds than it should receive in your entire lifetime. And the worst part is that once you inhale those particles, they stay in your lungs forever. Plutonium-239 is especially diabolical. It has a half-life of 24,100 years. That means if you inhale a microscopic particle of plutonium today, it's going to keep irradiating your lungs from the inside for the next 24,000 years. Of course, you're not going to live that long, but that particle is going to be there, destroying lung tissue long after your body has turned to dust. And the thing is that these particles are so small, they can pass through any normal mask. You need military protection equipment, specialized filters, pressurized air systems. Even the scientists who study these places have to use suits that completely isolate them from the external environment. They've documented cases of researchers who, despite using protection, developed respiratory problems years after their visits. Because when you play with radiation at these levels, even extreme precautions sometimes aren't enough. A tiny failure in equipment, a second without protection, and that's it. The damage is done. It's not that the town is contaminated. The town is the contamination. Every cubic meter of air, every grain of earth, every drop of rain that falls there becomes part of a giant toxic cloud that's going to persist for millennia. It's as if they had turned a piece of earth into an alien planet where human life simply cannot exist. These places are literally uninhabitable, not for decades, not for centuries, for millennia. We're talking about areas that are going to remain lethal when all current civilizations are ancient history. When our languages have been forgotten and our cities are ruins, these abandoned towns are going to still be there, silent and deadly, waiting for radiation to finally fade away. Foreshadowing. But this isn't the only place where time stopped. There are other towns, places where radiation didn't come from an accident, but from something much worse. Chapter 2. The Land That Glows in the Dark. April 26, 1986. Pripyat, Ukraine. A city of 50,000 inhabitants woke up not knowing that day would be the last normal day of their lives. At 1:23 in the morning, reactor number 4 at Chernobyl exploded, and with that explosion, the world's most famous ghost towns were born. But what no one tells you is that Pripyat wasn't the only place that emptied. There were smaller towns around, places that don't even appear in documentaries. Towns with names most people never heard: Kopachi, Zalicia, Opachi. Places where radiation arrived like an invisible cloud and stayed forever. In some of these towns, something happens that defies all logic. The earth literally glows in the dark. It's not a metaphor. It's Cherenkov radiation. When radioactive particles travel faster than the speed of light in water, they emit an electric blue glow, as if you had pieces of nuclear reactor buried in your house's garden. The children who lived nearby before the accident called those blue flashes they saw at night fairy lights. They didn't know they were seeing death shine. Their parents didn't know either. because no one told them what had really happened until it was too late. The exclusion zone they created after the disaster covers 2,600 square kilometers. To give you an idea, it's larger than all of Mexico City. A huge area where you simply can't live, where you can't grow food, where you can't have children, where normal human life stopped being possible. In the first 48 hours after the explosion, they evacuated 116,000 people. Imagine, in 2 days, more than 100,000 people had to abandon their homes forever. They carried one suitcase, maybe two. They thought they were going to return in a few days. Almost 40 years later, they're still waiting. Radiation levels at the epicenter reached 300,000 becquerels per square meter. To understand what that means, the food you normally eat has less than 100 becquerels per kilogram. Here we're talking about 3,000 times more radiation concentrated in each meter of Earth. It's as if they had sprayed invisible poison over thousands of square kilometers. And here comes something that will surprise you. Wild animals are thriving in the exclusion zone. There are more wolves, bears, deer, and birds than before the accident. Why? Because it turns out that radiation, although deadly for humans in the long term, is less harmful to wildlife than constant human presence. The wolves living there have cesium levels in their bodies that are 200 times higher than normal. They should be dead, but they keep hunting, reproducing, living their lives as if nothing happened. Birds show genetic mutations in 47% of their offspring, but populations keep growing. It's a brutal paradox. The place where humans can't survive became a paradise for animals. But the houses tell another story. In Pripyat, there are 1,200 apartments with electricity still working. Automatic systems continue maintaining temperature at 22 degrees Celsius. Lights turn on with motion sensors when drones pass by. Everything is prepared for someone to return home, but no one can do it. In the kitchens of those apartments, there's still food from 1986. Bread that doesn't rot because radiation killed even the bacteria that cause decomposition. Powdered milk that stays fresh after almost 4 decades. Mummified fruits that maintain their shape but could kill you if you touch them without protection. Scientists calculate that these areas are going to remain uninhabitable for the next 300 years minimum. That means when your great-great-grandchildren are old, this place is still going to be too dangerous for human life. We're talking about a permanent scar on the world map. But there's something even more disturbing. Research teams that have entered to document the state of buildings have found signs that someone has been living there illegally. Beds with used sheets, recently opened food cans, fires extinguished recently. There are people who have decided to return to their abandoned homes, knowing perfectly well that each day they spend there is taking years off their lives. They call them the returnees. They're mainly elderly people who prefer to die in their homeland, even though that land is slowly killing them. They say they prefer cancer at home to old age in exile. It's a decision that defies all logic but reveals something deep about human attachment to the place where we were born. Authorities officially don't allow anyone to live in the exclusion zone, but they also officially turn a blind eye to these returnees. Because what's the point of forcibly removing an 80-year-old grandfather who just wants to spend his last days in the town where he was born? Radiation is going to kill him in 5 or 10 years. Old age would have killed him in 5 or 10 years anyway. Tourist tours now organized to visit Chernobyl last maximum 6 hours. That's the maximum exposure they consider safe for a normal person. 6 hours in your entire life. And even so, guides carry Geiger counters constantly and have specific routes to minimize exposure. You can't touch anything. You can't sit anywhere. You can't take even a stone as a souvenir. And the thing is that the zone keeps growing. Each rain, each wind, moves radioactive particles to new areas. Cesium-137 filters into groundwater and travels kilometers underground. Forest fires in the zone release radiation back into the atmosphere. It's like a wound that won't finish healing, that keeps bleeding decades after the initial cut. The most chilling thing of all is that Chernobyl wasn't the worst possible scenario. Nuclear engineers have nightmares about something they call China syndrome, when a reactor's molten core completely penetrates containment and sinks into the earth until it reaches groundwater. If that had happened at Chernobyl, we would have lost not only northern Ukraine, but much of Eastern Europe. Millions of people would have had to evacuate permanently. But even without reaching that extreme, what did happen was enough to create the most contaminated zone on Earth. A place where time stopped, where normal human life stopped being possible, and where nature took control of the cities we built. Chapter 3. The Open-Air Human Laboratory. Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan. A name you probably never heard, but which should be engraved in humanity's collective memory as one of the most diabolical places we've created. Because here, there were no accidents. There were no technical errors. There were no unpleasant surprises. Here, for 40 years, they detonated nuclear bombs over civilian population on purpose. Between 1949 and 1989, the Soviet Union conducted 456 nuclear tests at this proving ground, 456 nuclear explosions in an area where 200,000 people lived. The accumulated power of all those detonations equals 2,500 bombs like Hiroshima's. Imagine, as if they had bombed Hiroshima 2,500 times in the same place for 4 decades. The testing ground covered 18,500 square kilometers. That's larger than all of El Salvador. And in the middle of that giant area there were towns, farms, schools, hospitals. People living normal lives while nuclear scientists used their territory as a large-scale death laboratory. They detonated the first bomb on August 29, 1949. Inhabitants of nearby towns saw a flash of light brighter than the sun, felt a tremor that broke windows 100 kilometers away, and then the cloud came. A giant black cloud that expanded across the sky like ink spilling in water. No one told them what it was. No one warned them of the danger. They simply continued with their lives while radioactive particles rained on their houses. Documents declassified years later revealed something chilling. Soviet scientists knew exactly what was happening to those populations. They had medical teams constantly monitoring radiation effects on local inhabitants, not to protect them, to study them, to see what happened when you expose humans to massive doses of radiation for decades. Children born in the zone during those 40 years had a 25% chance of being born with congenital malformations, 1 out of every 4 babies. Deformed arms, poorly developed internal organs, severe neurological problems. And we're not talking about isolated cases. We're talking about an epidemic of mutations that affected an entire generation. Local doctors began noticing that life expectancy in the region had dropped between 10 and 15 years compared to the rest of the country. Childhood cancer incidence shot up 80% above the national average. Leukemia cases multiplied by 5, and Soviet scientists took meticulous notes of everything. There was a town called Dolon that was especially close to the testing zone. Inhabitants received radiation doses up to 600 times higher than the limit considered safe. 600 times. In medical terms, it was like receiving a lethal dose every few months, but distributed in small amounts that didn't kill you immediately. They just slowly destroyed you from the inside. Pregnant women in Dolon were forbidden from leaving the town during gestation months. Officially, it was to protect their health, but internal documents reveal the truth. They wanted to study the effects of prenatal radiation on fetal development. They were using pregnant women as guinea pigs. In 1953, they detonated the first Soviet hydrogen bomb at Semipalatinsk. The explosion was so powerful, it was felt 1,000 kilometers away. The radiation that single bomb released was equivalent to all the radiation released at Chernobyl, but concentrated in one explosion. Towns within a 200-kilometer radius were covered with invisible radioactive rain. And here comes the most twisted part of all. When inhabitants of these towns began developing symptoms of radiation poisoning, local doctors had orders to never mention the word radiation in their diagnoses. Medical records spoke of unknown diseases, strange fevers, malformations of uncertain origin. It was a systematic medical cover-up. Scientists working at the proving ground lived in a closed city called Kurchatov, 150 kilometers from the testing zone. They had first-class hospitals, special schools for their children, supermarkets with imported products. Meanwhile, the Kazakhs who lived closer to the explosions didn't even have access to radiation specialists. In the 60s, when international protests against atmospheric nuclear testing began, the Soviets simply moved the explosions underground. But the damage was already done. The soil, water, air, everything was contaminated. And underground tests continued filtering radiation into groundwater for decades. When they finally stopped testing in 1989, there were 10,000 people who had to be permanently relocated. But not because the government had become more humanitarian, but because radiation levels had reached a point where they could no longer publicly deny the danger. The local population had begun organizing, demanding answers, documenting health effects. By then, 47 complete towns had been abandoned, not officially evacuated like at Chernobyl, but simply emptied. People left on their own when they realized their children were being born sick, that their crops weren't growing normally, that animals were developing strange tumors. The Semipalatinsk proving ground left behind 15,000 abandoned structures, houses, farms, schools, hospitals. But unlike Chernobyl, where abandonment was sudden and dramatic, here it was gradual, as if radiation had slowly drained life from the region for decades until leaving it empty. Genetic studies conducted in the 90s revealed that radiation effects were transmitted to the third generation. Grandchildren of people exposed to nuclear tests continued being born with malformations and health problems. Radiation had literally rewritten the DNA of entire families. The most outrageous thing is that all this was perfectly documented. The Soviets kept meticulous records of each test, each radiation dose measured, each effect observed in the population. It wasn't an experiment that got out of control. It was a deliberate, systematic experiment that lasted 40 years and used as test subjects 200,000 people who never gave their consent. Today, more than 30 years after testing stopped, there are still areas of the proving ground where soil has radiation levels 50 times higher than normal, places where you still can't grow safe food, where groundwater remains contaminated, where being born is still a dangerous genetic lottery. Semipalatinsk wasn't an accident. It was a crime against humanity that lasted 4 decades and turned an entire region into an open-air human laboratory. And the most terrifying thing is that it wasn't the only place where this happened. Chapter 4. The Earthquake That Awakened the Demon. March 11, 2011, 2:46 p.m. local time, Japan. The Earth began moving with a force not seen in the country's modern history. Magnitude 9.0 on the Richter scale. The earthquake was so powerful it moved Japan's main island 2.4 meters to the east and accelerated Earth's rotation, shortening the day by 1.8 microseconds. But the earthquake was just the beginning. 40 minutes later, the tsunami arrived. Waves up to 40 meters high, moving at 80 kilometers per hour inland. At the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, designed to resist tsunamis of maximum 6 meters, water reached 15 meters high. Emergency generators flooded. Cooling systems collapsed. And then the nuclear nightmare began. In the following 72 hours, 3 nuclear reactors went into complete meltdown. Nuclear fuel literally melted, creating a radioactive mass that perforated steel and concrete containers like hot butter. It was the first level 7 nuclear disaster since Chernobyl, but with a crucial difference. This time, it was happening live, broadcast on television to the whole world. Hydrogen explosions that destroyed reactor buildings released columns of radioactive steam that rose several kilometers into the atmosphere. But unlike Chernobyl, where radiation dispersed over land, here, 80% of contamination fell directly into the Pacific Ocean. They were poisoning the planet's largest sea. Evacuation was organized chaos. First, they evacuated within a 3-kilometer radius, then 10, then 20. In total, 154,000 people had to abandon their homes in a matter of hours. But this time there was something different. The evacuation was being broadcast live. The entire world watched an entire region empty in real time. Naoto Kan, the Japanese prime minister, admitted years later that they considered evacuating all of Tokyo. Tokyo, a megalopolis of 37 million inhabitants, the largest evacuation in human history. The plan existed, buses were ready. If winds had changed direction, half of Japan would have become uninhabitable. The city of Nami, 8 kilometers from the plant, had 21,000 inhabitants. In 6 hours, it was completely empty. But something unique happened here. Unlike other nuclear disasters, evacuation was so quick that people didn't have time to take almost anything. Houses remained as if their owners had left 5 minutes to go to the store. Robots they sent to inspect the interior of damaged reactors broke down in a matter of hours. Radiation was so intense, it fried the most resistant electronic circuits they had. Robots designed to function in space, capable of withstanding cosmic radiation, became junk in 3 hours inside Fukushima. But what really distinguishes Fukushima is that they never stopped documenting everything. There are high-definition videos of the exact moment reactors exploded. There are real-time measurements of every radiation reading. There are recorded testimonies of workers who stayed inside knowing they were probably going to die. Everything is documented with almost obsessive precision. The 50 workers who stayed inside the plant during the first critical days knew they were receiving lethal doses of radiation. They called them the Fukushima 50, or the liquidators. Some of them died of cancer in the following years. Others developed leukemia, but they managed to prevent the disaster from being 10 times worse. The exclusion zone they created afterward included complete towns that had existed for centuries: Okuma, Futaba, Tomioka, places with 800-year-old Buddhist temples that suddenly became too radioactive for monks to enter and pray. The millennial history of these places was cut off from one day to another. In Tomioka, a city of 16,000 inhabitants, they left everything exactly as it was. Traffic lights continued working for years, changing from green to red for completely empty streets. Automatic irrigation systems kept watering gardens no one was going to see. Alarms from abandoned cars sounded when batteries discharged, but there was no one to hear them. Ocean contamination was something never seen before. For weeks, the plant was dumping directly into the seawater that had been in contact with molten nuclear fuel. It's calculated they released 1.3 million liters of radioactive water into the ocean. Tritium concentrations reached 40 times the legal limit. Fukushima radiation was detected on the coasts of California and Chile months later. Tuna caught 10,000 kilometers away had detectable levels of cesium-137 from Fukushima. For the first time in history, a nuclear accident in one country contaminated oceans on the other side of the planet. What's most chilling is they still haven't finished cleaning up. 12 years later, they're still pumping water to cool damaged reactors. That water becomes contaminated, and they have to store it in giant tanks. They already have more than 1,000 tanks full of radioactive water and don't know what to do with it. The current plan is to dilute it and dump it into the ocean over the next 30 years. In abandoned houses in the exclusion zone, something surreal happens. Everything works perfectly, but no one can use it. Refrigerators keep cooling food no one is going to eat. Televisions turn on with remote control, but show programs for an audience that no longer exists. Air conditioners maintain perfect temperatures in houses where entering can kill you. 2,400 people still haven't been able to return to their homes 12 years later. Their houses are there, intact with electricity working, but radiation levels remain too high for permanent residence. It's as if they had created ghost cities on pause, waiting for radiation to drop enough for life to return. Researchers studying the zone have found something fascinating and terrifying. Nature is adapting to radiation faster than expected. There are plants that have developed mechanisms to concentrate radiation in their roots and keep their fruits clean. Animals that have developed genetic resistance to radiation levels that should kill them. In some areas of the exclusion zone, radiation levels have dropped faster than scientific models predicted. Not because radiation is decomposing faster, but because rain, wind, and vegetation growth are redistributing radioactive particles in unpredictable ways. But there are specific zones where radiation remains extremely high. Hotspots where cesium-137 concentrated in such a way that they'll remain lethal for decades. They're like islands of death surrounded by areas that are slowly returning to normal. The Japanese government calculates that complete cleanup of Fukushima will take 30 to 40 more years, and it will cost more than $200 billion. It's the most expensive and complex decontamination project in human history. And even with all that effort, some areas will never be completely safe again. What makes Fukushima unique among nuclear disasters is that it happened in the social media era. There are thousands of home videos of the moment of the tsunami, of explosions, of evacuation. There are real-time posts from people fleeing. There are photos taken with cell phones from inside the exclusion zone. For the first time, a nuclear disaster was massively documented from the inside. Fukushima demonstrated that even in the world's most technologically prepared country, nature can awaken demons we don't know how to control, and that when those demons awaken, they can change the world map forever. Chapter 5. The Towns That Never Officially Existed. There are places on maps where entire towns should be marked, but you only see blank spaces. It's not that they forgot to draw them. It's that officially, those towns never existed. 23 communities deliberately erased from official cartographic records, places where families lived, where there were schools and stores, where people had postal addresses. Until one day, someone decided it was better to pretend they had never been there. The reason is always the same: radiation. But not radiation from famous accidents like Chernobyl or Fukushima. We're talking about silent, systematic contamination that accumulated for decades near uranium processing plants, nuclear weapon manufacturing sites, or radioactive waste deposits that no one wants to admit exist. In the United States during the Cold War, they built uranium processing plants near small rural communities because it was cheap, because there was little political opposition, and because if something went wrong, it wouldn't make national news. The problem is that something always went wrong. And when it went wrong, the standard solution was to relocate people and erase the place from official maps. Military archives about these places are sealed for 75 years. 75 years. That means information about what really happened in these towns won't be public until approximately 2050. By then, most people who lived through these events will be dead, and those responsible for the decisions will be ancient history. It's calculated that 45,000 people were relocated without official public record during the Cold War period in the United States due to radioactive contamination. 45,000, that's not a small number. It's like evacuating an entire medium-sized city. But since relocations were done town by town, family by family, over decades, it never felt like a massive event that deserved media attention. In Hanford, Washington, there was a plutonium production plant that operated from 1943 to 1987. During those 44 years, it intentionally released radioactive gases into the atmosphere as part of experiments to study how radiation dispersed in the environment. Nearby towns received accumulated doses of iodine-131 that in some cases exceeded 50 times the limit considered safe. But here comes what's really disturbing. Residents of these towns didn't know they were being used as experimentation subjects. Radiation releases were done at night, without warnings, without protection measures. Hanford scientists secretly monitored radiation levels in local milk, crops, drinking water. But that information was classified. The inhabitants themselves didn't have access to data about their exposure. When they finally closed Hanford in 1987, there were 53 million gallons of liquid radioactive waste stored in underground tanks. Many of those tanks were leaking. It's estimated that 1 million gallons of radioactive liquid filtered into the soil and reached the Columbia River's groundwater. But this wasn't made public until the 90s. In Rocky Flats, Colorado, they had a secret nuclear detonator manufacturing plant just 25 kilometers from Denver. For 40 years, they burned plutonium waste in the open air. Literally. They made bonfires with radioactive material and let the smoke disperse over the Denver metropolitan region. It's estimated they released enough plutonium into the environment to contaminate 17,000 residential properties. What's most chilling is that many of these plants were deliberately located near minority or low-income communities. In the southeastern United States, more than 70% of uranium processing plants were built in predominantly African American or Hispanic counties. It wasn't coincidence. It was deliberate policy, putting the most dangerous operations where there was less political power to resist. Epidemiological studies done decades later in these communities revealed patterns of childhood cancer, leukemia, and congenital malformations up to 15 times higher than the national average. But when affected families tried to sue the government, they found that many records had been destroyed or classified as state secrets. In Navajo Nation in the southwestern United States, there were more than 500 abandoned uranium mines. 500. Mining companies arrived in the 50s, extracted uranium for nuclear bombs, and when they finished, they simply left. They left mountains of radioactive waste in the open air, contaminated water wells, and tunnels that continue releasing radon gas decades later. Navajo communities living near these mines developed lung cancer rates 28 times higher than average. But since the mines were on tribal territory, technically outside direct state jurisdiction, cleanup was delayed for decades. Only in 2007 did the federal government admit responsibility and begin a decontamination program that will last until 2030. In Nevada, during atmospheric nuclear bomb tests in the desert, there were rural towns that regularly received radioactive fallout. Residents called the radioactive particles that fell after explosions pink snow. Children played in that snow without knowing that each flake contained enough radiation to cause cancer decades later. St. George, Utah, was 220 kilometers from the Nevada test site. During the 50s and 60s, it received radioactive fallout from more than 100 atmospheric nuclear explosions. Childhood leukemia incidence in St. George became 2.5 times higher than the national average. But the federal government didn't admit the connection until 1990, 30 years after testing stopped. In many of these communities, lawsuits took decades to resolve. In 1990, Congress approved the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which authorized payments of up to $50,000 for victims of radioactive exposure. But to qualify, you had to prove you had lived in specific areas during specific periods and had developed specific types of cancer. Thousands of affected families couldn't meet the bureaucratic requirements. The compensation program has paid over $2.3 billion so far to victims of radioactive exposure in the United States. That gives you an idea of the scale of the problem. We're not talking about isolated cases, we're talking about systematic contamination that affected hundreds of thousands of people for decades. What's most outrageous is that many of these contaminated sites still haven't been completely cleaned up. In Hanford, Washington, decontamination is calculated to take up to 75 more years and cost $100 billion. It's the most expensive environmental cleanup project in United States history. In other countries, it was worse. In the former Soviet Union, there were entire cities dedicated to nuclear weapons production that didn't appear on any map. Chelyabinsk, 65, Tomsk, 7, Krasnoyarsk, 26. They officially didn't exist. Residents couldn't receive direct mail, couldn't invite visitors, couldn't leave without special permits. They were like nuclear prisons, where entire families lived in absolute secrecy. When the Soviet government collapsed in 1991, these secret cities were left in legal limbo. Some had radioactive contamination levels comparable to Chernobyl, but there was no budget for mass evacuations. Many residents simply continued living there because they had nowhere to go. Today, more than 30 years after the Cold War ended, there are still sites contaminated by radiation that officially don't exist, places that don't appear on Google Maps, that don't have recognized postal codes, where people live in a kind of geographical limbo. They are the ghost towns that were never officially towns to begin with. The most terrifying lesson from all these cases is that you don't need a catastrophic nuclear accident to create uninhabitable zones. You only need decades of systematic negligence, government secrecy, and the willingness to sacrifice entire communities for national security. Some of the most contaminated places on the planet weren't created by accidents. They were created by decisions. Chapter 6. The Silence After the Roar. There are 47 towns completely evacuated due to radiation scattered around the world. 47. From Siberia to Nevada, from Japan to Kazakhstan, humanity has created its own collection of forbidden places. 2.3 million people have been permanently displaced. 150,000 abandoned structures in exclusion zones wait in silence for someone to return. but no one can do it. This is the inventory of abandonment, the final accounting of what it costs to play with atoms. We're not talking about science fiction or post-apocalyptic worlds. We're talking about real places with real addresses, where real families lived normal lives until radiation expelled them forever. The process of creating these ghost towns extended over 75 years of nuclear history. From the first atomic tests in 1945 to the most recent disasters, humanity has been sowing the planet with zones where human life simply isn't viable. It's as if we had been drawing black holes on the world map one by one, decade after decade. And there are people whose job is to take care of these black holes. 340 workers distributed across different countries have jobs that basically consist of watching over places where no one can live. They are the guardians of nothingness. They enter in maximum shifts of 2 weeks because accumulated exposure would kill them if they stayed longer. They change their protection equipment every 4 hours. They constantly monitor their radiation levels with dosimeters that sound alarms if they approach dangerous limits. Their jobs will exist for the next 300 years minimum. Think about it. There are jobs created today that will continue being necessary when your great-great-grandchildren are elderly. Jobs that exist solely because we created places so dangerous they need permanent supervision, even though no one can live there. It's maintenance work for abandonment. But nature doesn't understand radiation, or rather it understands radiation in a way we didn't expect. In many of these abandoned zones, wildlife didn't just survive, it thrived. Without humans hunting, building, contaminating with industrial chemicals, many ecosystems recovered spectacularly. There are denser and more biodiverse forests in radioactive zones than in many normal areas of the world. Plants developed fascinating mechanisms to deal with radiation. Some concentrate radioactive elements in their roots and keep their fruits clean. Others developed special pigmentations that help them resist cellular damage. Fungi especially seem to thrive in highly radioactive environments. There are fungal species that literally feed on radiation, using melanin to convert gamma rays into chemical energy. Scientists have found fungi in Chernobyl that grow toward radiation sources as if they were plants seeking sunlight. These fungi have melanin levels 500 times higher than normal fungi. It's as if they had evolved to live off something that kills us. In some areas, these fungi form black carpets that cover square kilometers of contaminated territory. Animals also show surprising adaptations. Chernobyl wolves developed immune systems more resistant to cancer. Migratory birds that spend time in radioactive zones developed more efficient antioxidant mechanisms. Frogs show darker colorations that help them resist radiation. It's accelerated evolution in real time. But for humans, these places remain permanent scars on the planet's habitable geography. The most optimistic calculations say some areas could be safe for resettlement in 300 years. The most pessimistic calculations speak of 24,000 years. 24,000 years. That's longer than all known human civilizations have existed. To put that in perspective, when Egyptians were building pyramids 4,500 years ago, these radioactive places will still be uninhabitable in 19,500 more years. When Rome was at its peak 2,000 years ago, these places will continue being lethal for 22,000 more years. We're talking about permanent marks in the planet's geological history. Plutonium-239, one of the most common elements in these contaminated sites, has a half-life of 24,100 years. That means every 24,000 years, half the radiation disappears. But only half. After 48,000 years, a quarter remains. After 72,000 years, an eighth remains. For it to reach truly safe levels, you need to wait about 240,000 years. 250,000 years. Modern humanity, Homo sapiens, has about 300,000 years of existence. We're talking about contamination that will last almost as long as our entire species has existed. It's as if we had mortgaged the planet's future for the geological equivalent of all human history, and these places don't stay still. Radioactive particles move. Rains drag them to new areas. Winds disperse them. Forest fires release them back into the atmosphere. Earthquakes can break underground containers and release contamination that had been encapsulated for decades. It's contamination that migrates, expands, seeks new places to settle. Monitoring systems installed in these zones will have to function for centuries. There are automatic sensors that transmit radiation data 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Systems that will have to be maintained, updated, repaired for longer than most modern countries have existed. It's infrastructure for eternity. Some governments have started designing warning monuments that can last 10,000 years. Monuments made with materials that don't corrode, with symbols that are comprehensible to future civilizations that might not speak our languages. How do you explain to someone from the year 12,000 that this place is dangerous if we don't know what languages will exist by then? Future archaeologists will find these radioactive zones like we find Egyptian or Mayan ruins. But unlike ancient ruins, these will continue being lethal. They will be the first archaeological sites in history that can kill the archaeologists who study them. Radioactive ruins that tell the story of a civilization that learned to split atoms before learning to completely control them. In some places, natural recovery is happening faster than expected. Not because radiation is decomposing faster, but because nature is finding ways to encapsulate it, isolate it, coexist with it. Forests grow over contaminated material and somehow manage to maintain lower radiation levels on their surface. It's as if nature were healing the wounds we made, but at its own pace and with its own methods. But there are specific zones that will continue being lethal for millennia, regardless of what nature does. Hotspots where radioactive material concentration is so high that nothing can live there. They're like permanent death islands surrounded by areas that are slowly returning to life. These abandoned towns have become unintentional laboratories for studying how life responds to extreme radiation. Scientists from around the world go to these places to study accelerated evolution, genetic adaptation, radiological resistance. It's science that emerges from tragedy, knowledge we paid for with entire towns. In the end, the account is simple but terrifying. We've created 47 places on Earth where humans can't live because of decisions we made ourselves. They weren't asteroids, volcanoes, or earthquakes. It was us. We split atoms without fully understanding the consequences. And now we have to live with those consequences for the next millennia. A Geiger counter continues ticking in Chernobyl, 50 clicks per second. It will take 24,000 years to go silent. That's 760 billion clicks. Each click, a deadly particle. Each particle, a reminder that some human decisions transcend generations. The towns are still there, the houses wait, but the wait will be longer than all of humanity's written history. Some mistakes can't be undone. Only wait for time to erase them. If it ever does. Chapter 7. The Legacy We Cannot Undo. Google Earth has a function that allows you to see satellite images of any place in the world. You can zoom into your house, the school where you went as a child, the park where you played. But there are specific coordinates where, when you zoom in, the images are deliberately blurred, pixelated, censored. Not because there are secret military installations there, but because there's something much more dangerous. Places where radiation is so high that not even satellites can take clear photos without their cameras being damaged. This is the new reality of the world we live in, a world where there are GPS coordinates that mark places forbidden to humanity, where there are addresses that exist but to which you can never send a letter, where there are towns that appear on historical maps but have been erased from the planet's practical geography. And the strangest thing of all is that we've gotten used to this. We've normalized the existence of exclusion zones. We've integrated into our daily vocabulary concepts like radioactive half-life and cumulative lethal dose. We've created a new category of tourism, radioactive tourism. Thousands of people pay to visit places where they can't stay more than a few hours without risking their lives. Chernobyl has become one of Ukraine's most popular tourist destinations. Every year, 130,000 people visit the exclusion zone. They pay $100 for a 6-hour tour where they can see nuclear apocalypse up close. They take selfies with protection suits in front of destroyed reactors. They buy souvenirs with radiation logos. It's as if we've turned our worst mistakes into tourist attractions. But beneath that macabre normalization, there's a reality we cannot ignore. These places aren't going to disappear. They're going to still be there when our children are old, when our grandchildren have children, when civilizations that haven't been born yet are exploring the ruins of our cities. We've created permanent scars on the planet's geography. Future archaeologists are going to have to develop new techniques to study our ruins. They're going to need specialized robots to excavate radioactive sites. They're going to have to use protection suits to examine the remains of our civilization. We're going to be the first culture in history that left dangerous ruins for its own descendants. Imagine an archaeologist from the year 3000 trying to understand why we abandoned entire cities that were perfectly functional, trying to decipher why there are places where all everyday objects emit radiation, trying to comprehend why we built nuclear plants near communities and then sealed them as radioactive tombs. The warning signs we're designing for these places have to work for 10,000 years. 10,000 years. Egyptian hieroglyphs are 5,000 years old, and we already have trouble understanding them. How do you design a symbol that tells mortal danger to someone from the year 12,000 who might not speak any of the languages that exist today? Some scientists propose using universal symbols, faces that express horror and pain, colors that all cultures associate with danger, shapes that transmit the idea of death. Others suggest creating artificial landscapes that feel inherently threatening. Black hills, pointed structures, fields of metal spines. The idea is to create places that no one wants to explore, even without understanding why. But there's a problem with this strategy. Human curiosity is stronger than fear. If you mark a place as dangerous, eventually someone is going to want to investigate why. If you build monuments that scream, "Don't come near," you're going to attract exactly the type of people who approach places where they shouldn't go. The International Atomic Energy Agency has started creating what they call institutional memory. Systems designed to transmit information about radioactive sites across generations, databases that are constantly updated, organizations that commit to maintaining records for centuries, protocols for transferring responsibility from one generation to the next. It's like creating secular religions whose only purpose is to remember where our poisons are buried. Memory cults that are going to have to persist longer than most current religions have existed. Traditions that are going to have to survive wars, civilizational collapses, radical technological changes. But even with all these systems, there's something deeply disturbing about the idea that we've created problems that are going to require constant surveillance for longer than human civilization has existed. We've mortgaged the species' future for technologies we developed in less than a century. Future generations are going to have to dedicate constant resources to maintaining sites that we contaminated. They're going to have to train radiation specialists for places that we made uninhabitable. They're going to have to develop technologies for problems that we created. It's the cruelest form of inheritance, bequeathing problems without solutions. And the most ironic thing is that many of these places became radioactive because of technologies that were supposed to improve the world. Nuclear energy was promoted as the energy of the future, clean and unlimited. Nuclear tests were justified as necessary for national security. Uranium processing was presented as industrial progress. Each disaster began with good intentions. But good intentions don't neutralize plutonium. The most advanced science can't accelerate radioactive decay. The most sophisticated technology can't undo genetic contamination. We've learned that there are some genies that, once they're out of the bottle, can't be put back in. Children born today are going to grow up in a world where nuclear radiation is part of the normal landscape. They're going to learn in school about exclusion zones like we learned about mountains and rivers. They're going to see areas marked as prohibited on maps and think that's normal. For them, radioactive towns are going to be part of the world's natural geography. But maybe that normalization is necessary. Maybe the only way to live with the consequences of our mistakes is to integrate them into our daily reality. Maybe the alternative, living in constant denial, is more dangerous than accepting that we've permanently changed the planet's habitability. In the end, these towns corrupted by radiation are involuntary monuments to our capacity to create problems that transcend our lives. They are physical reminders that some decisions have consequences that last millennia. They are lessons engraved in the planet's geography about the limits of our wisdom. Radiation doesn't judge, it doesn't punish, it doesn't forgive. It simply exists, persistent and indifferent, marking time in Geiger counterclicks. And we who created these places have to live with the knowledge that we've permanently altered the habitability of pieces of the planet that were once home to normal families, living normal lives. Some mistakes can be corrected, others can be learned from, but some mistakes can only be inherited, and hope that future generations are wiser than us to not repeat them. The counter keeps ticking, time keeps passing, and the towns keep waiting, silent and lethal, for someone to find a way to undo what can no longer be undone.